Hello and welcome. My name is Margit Bantowsky. I am a Trillium Awakening teacher and a transformative coach. Trillium Awakening is a spiritual path that integrates consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality. Today's inquiry is about being versus doing. And this inquiry of being versus doing is sort of at the heart of awakened activism, and as such warrants much further exploration. So thank you for joining me today. I like to begin my conversations with a poem, and I've chosen one from this beautiful book called The Fire of Darkness, poetry by Alfred or Fred LaMotte, with some beautiful artwork by Roshani Rhea. So, the first poem, they're not titled. True oneness is the chaos of opposites. You can't escape from being whole. The golden sun creates your elegant shadow. Between darkness and light, the sun and the moon, the seer and the seen, is an ocean of blood that cannot quench the soul because it is the soul. If you're not full of contradictions, you've come to the wrong planet. Isn't the answer to every prayer the stillness between heartbeats? Angels stand in a very long line to get a human body and learn the truth. We don't just make our honey from flowers, we flavor it with weeds, thorns, pungent desires. I like that poem because it talks about the chaos of opposites, and some of the necessary qualities of being a human. And I'd like to begin with some questions. So I invite you to lean into what you already know about being versus doing before I then offer more of a conceptual framework. So if you don't have pen and paper handy right now, you might want to push pause and go get a pen and paper so you can journal. Another option is just to sit with the questions in contemplation. So there are 5 questions. And the first question is, what does being mean to you? What does being mean to you? Go ahead and take a moment and either journal about this or sit in contemplation. And if you're watching this as a video, go ahead and push pause and give yourself whatever time you need for this question. The second question is, what are some aspects of your being? What are the components of your being? When we say being, your being, what's it made of? So I invite you to take some time to either write about that or go into meditation. Feel free to push pause on the video. Give yourself the time you need. The third question is, what are some sources or drivers of action for you? So when you reflect on your actions in the past week or the past year or even today so far, what What was the stimulus? What moved you into action? Just take some time to consider the many different motivators behind your actions. The fourth question has 4 parts. You'll see the pattern as we go along. So question 4A is, think of an example from your life of when your being or beingness was effective. And once you have a moment that you're remembering where your beingness was effective, notice or see if you can identify what it was about your beingness that made it effective. Take a moment to contemplate when your beingness was effective. Again, push pause if you want more time. Question 4B is, allow yourself to remember a time, a moment, specific incidents, when your doing was effective. When your doingness, what you were doing, was effective. And when you have that example in mind, take a little longer to notice or discern what it was about your doing that made it effective. What contributed to your doingness's effectiveness, the effectiveness of your action. The third question, question 4C, is the reverse. So I invite you to remember a specific moment when your beingness was ineffective, when how you and who you were being was not effective in the situation. And you can push pause if you want to give yourself some time. And question 4D is, allow yourself to remember a moment when your doing, your action, was ineffective. And when you have that memory, taking some time to discern what it was about your action, your doing, that made it ineffective. And the fifth and final question is, think of a time, imagine a time, a moment, letting yourself remember a moment when being and doing were in flow. When your being and your doing were in flow. And we've all had these experiences. It may have been short, And really what I want is for you to remember what it felt like. So take a moment to not only remember that specific moment, but to feel it, really letting yourself feel it in your body when being and doing were in flow. If you want to push pause and give yourself time there, this is a good time to do it. So now I'm going to provide some more conceptual work here, some framing to help the inquiry and conversation about being versus doing. And I did some really high-tech graphics here, but hopefully this will work well enough. So I drew this chart, this graph, in a linear frame, the continuum between being and doing. And when we think of awakened activism on this continuum from being and doing, we can see on the being end of things might be something that we would call subtle activism. And as an example, there's meditation, deep meditation that is in the service of the well-being of all beings. A beautiful book that explores that end of the spectrum is called Subtle Activism by David Nichol. And he did quite a bit of research and beautifully summarizes the effectiveness and actual measurable effects of deep contemplation on cities and amount of violence in certain cities. So that's one end of the spectrum. So our being, our ability to tap into the fabric of life and allow our consciousness and our compassion and our intention to influence the world, to offer that into the fabric of the universe. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, more action and outward oriented, might be what we call traditional activism. We often think of protests or, creating legislation, demonstrating, and getting really involved in the decision-making process or putting our lives on the line to take a stand for the well-being of others. And as I was drawing this linear kind of horizontal map of activism, the activism in relationship to being and doing, I realized, it might actually not be quite so flat. There actually could be very much a three-dimensionality to it. So I wanted to offer another way of envisioning this. So I drew a picture, which I call the ecology of being and doing. So I've located being at the center. It looks like a series of concentric circles. I would invite you to look at it as a spherical, three-dimensional model, but for ease of description, it's flat on this piece of paper. So in the center is our being, who and how we are being, which influences the first concentric ring outside the skin of our body, which would be our intimates, our family, our beloveds, our friends, people that we interact with a lot and are close to. The next layer out would be our community and bioregion. Next layer out would be our nation and or our continent. Next layer out would be global or Gaia level. And then finally, galactic and universal. So it occurred to me as I was mapping out our being as it affects broader and broader communities, that our doing is actually deeply informed by relationship. And in the Trillium Awakening path, we awaken not only to consciousness, the unbounded nature of self, we awaken into our bodies, an embodied consciousness awakening. So we embody that unbounded interbeing consciousness in our physical reality. And the third petal of the trillium flower, it's a 3-petaled lily, trillium flower, the third petal is mutuality. So when you look at being versus the ecology, the ecology of being and doing, that in the heart of it is our beingness, and each layer of this sphere is relationship, right? So relationship to our intimates, relationship to our community and local land area, relationship to our country and or continent, relationship to the planet as a whole, relationship to the universe. So mutuality becomes inextricably related to the doing, right? We are taking action, not in a vacuum. We're taking action in deep relatedness. And all these levels of relatednesses exist, whether or not we're conscious of them, right? Awakening includes becoming more and more conscious of all the levels of interbeing that we are. So speaking of the layers that we are, so in the center is this green self, the beingness. And instead of going out, I want to go in now for a moment and illuminate some aspects of being. So here's what it looks like when we zoom in to that green dot in the center. And I just want to say, this is my take. It's not the Trillium teachings per se. It's sort of an embellished and slightly elaborated way of looking at this that I just kind of pulled together, synthesizing a lot of different materials. So at the very center of our being, I'm going to go from the most subtle to the most coarse. So at the most essential inner ultimate subjectivity of self, we could say is the source consciousness. So it's absolute consciousness. There are people who experience that consciousness by way of having no self, like the self is gone and there's this pure consciousness that's permeates everything. So it's the non-egoic, non-self-referential, absolute consciousness that permeates everything. So at the center is source consciousness. The next layer out could be called soul consciousness, or our spark of uniqueness. At some point, the sort of undifferentiated universal consciousness starts to collapse just a little and becomes a particular point of view, which is the eyes that you're looking through, right? So this particular point of view, that's my point of view, could be called the soul consciousness, my unique perspective my unique awareness or essence, the unique essence, the sort of conscious essence of myself. And according to some researchers, there are some very distinct personality aspects, even at this super subtle level of soul consciousness. There's the beginning of personality, the beginning of the flavor of your nature. The next level that I drew into this model is what is it? What do I call it? Energetic body. So that's we have the point of view, and then we start sensing a quality of energy that's primary to the physical body. It's taken me a long time to come into the awareness of that and sensing that. Some of you probably have been aware of that for a long time, but it's the energetic uniqueness as it starts to coalesce out of consciousness into more experiential density, can pass through this layer called energy. And then finally, the physical body. So the physical body with its preferences and its quirks and its temperament, right? There's a biological temperament, not just the essence soul temperament, but a sort of biological temperament. The emotions that come through, the thoughts that come through, all related to this particular physicality that we're inhabiting. So I just wanted to show you that our beingness is multidimensional. It's not just, I'm being. What are the aspects of being? So that's one way to look at the aspects of being. There's lots of models. So this is not the ultimate way of looking at it, but just a way to point. And I invite you to consider, what does it give you? What does it give us to have access, experiential and knowingness access to all those levels of our being, from absolute source consciousness to soul to energetic to embodied physicality. That's a topic for another call, perhaps, another presentation, but just consider, for those of you who have experienced those dimensions and are very well aware of them, what does that give you? Finally, I want to come back to this model. Now that you know what the green center in the middle is, I want to point out that actually, instead of a sphere, it's kind of a toroidal shape, a torus, which is a donut, right? So we're the eye of the donut. We come out, relate to people close to us, our bioregion, nation, Gaia, universe. And as we go way out into the universe, this whole thing is like a Mobius, 3D Mobius thing, and it loops back on itself. So there's a way in which that relatedness, as we extend out into infinity, that relatedness becomes who we are, and it becomes part of our source consciousness, and then we differentiate to our uniqueness. The uniqueness relates to the external world, to the infinite, and then we come back into the center. So that's just a way of conceptualizing being. So when bringing this conversation back to doing, the doing, again, as I said, is deeply related to mutuality, how we relate to all of those other levels of the onion, the toroidal onion. And in order to respond sort of in a creative and generative way to our intimates, to our bioregion, to our nation, and to the earth, we actually need to do some personal work. We need to heal the trauma and all those areas where we're contracted, because that gets in the way of relationship. So all the places where we've been wounded are places where we're protecting ourselves, and that protection, while keeping us safe and helped us survive actually gets in the way of our ability to be permeable to our surroundings. So you'll notice, or you might recognize that the question, what is driving your actions? Sometimes our trauma response is what's driving our actions. Our fears are what's driving our actions. Our neuroses are what's driving our actions. So in awakened activism, it's really critical, actually, to do our shadow work, to do our down work, to look at the distortions that trauma has caused in our self-perception and perception of the world, and the distortions in motivation, survival impulses versus authentic expression and creative impulses. So ultimately, where is this heading? Remember on the outside edge of the toroidal shape, going into universal relatedness and universal consciousness, a beautiful book that talks about our human development and trajectory towards that universal consciousness is this book called The Living Universe by Dwayne Elgin. Just one of my favorite books to contextualize human development and the sweep of history, sort of historical, and what's possible now, where are we headed now. And he talks about flow, that there's 3 stages, and at the last stage, there's this way of interbeing where our organism is so embedded in the matrix of life, and our consciousness is so clear or anchored in the universal awareness that we become agents of life. So he has a beautiful analogy where it's like riding a bicycle. And if you are riding the bicycle at the same speed as the wind, you don't notice it. It's effortless. But if you try to go ahead of the wind, then you get some resistance from the front. If you go too slow, then there's resistance, there's pressure from the back. So that sweet spot where there's no pressure, when you're going at the same speed as the wind, is sort of the quality. One analogy of talking about flow, where being and doing are integrated with the environment. And I also want to say that being and doing need to be integrated within the self. Like, what's integrity mean to you, right? What does integrity or inner coherence, so that who we are, who we authentically are, is expressed in our actions. There's coherence between the inner and outer, between our being and our action. Another way of pointing towards this flow is described by Ted Strauss, who is a Trillium Awakening teacher and took some time to do his own research and synthesis. He and his partner, Carole Griggs, looked at all these different psychological models of human development, Erickson and Piaget, etc., Maslow, and dozens of others, as well as spiritual maps of human spiritual development, and synthesized them into this brilliant model called iConscious, the iConscious model of human development. And of course, it's a book. And he also talks about this flow that there's 3 major phases of development, where it's dual, unified, and singular. And in Trillium Awakening, the whole being realization is the beginning of the unified phase. But there's more. The 3rd phase is singular, and this is where the egoic need to drive action falls away, takes a back seat, and what becomes the foreground is a seamlessness of being and doing in the embedded context of the flow of life. This is not his language. The way I might phrase that is conscious, co-creative, co-evolution. Conscious in the sense that it's aware, but not conscious in the sense that it's egoically driven at all. It's a spacious, responsive flow state of being and doing that arises in the context of absolute embeddedness in our world, in our universe. So that's a context, sort of physical, spiritual, and metaphysical context of being versus doing, and points to the possibility of the two of them coming together in an effortless flow in the service of the benefit and mutual evolution of life. And in closing, I have one more poem from Fred LaMotte. And thank you. Thank you for joining me in this inquiry. There's so much more to go, but it's a juicy chapter. We met in the precious moment before creation. Though I was unborn, you left black crescents and stars all over my body. Wounds that could see, eyes that could never be healed. Then a swirl of thirst in the nectar of emptiness turned my shadow into fire. What burned me away completely, I became. So, may the force be with us all, and blessings on your unfolding and your desire to be of service to this incredible planet we call home. Bye for now.